Firstly, when the wood is brought into the workshop, I identify that I have gotten all of the wood that was ordered. My first step consists of choosing the timber that I want to be my top, sides and bottom. I then measure and mark them to size and cut on the drops or to length. Once all pieces have been cut 3 times at their lengths, I align the different pieces on a bench and make sure the end grain is facing a different direction before cutting biscuits to ensure the wood doesn't cut. Once I have biscuit cutted the timber, I set up some sash clamps and glue my pieces together and leave them to dry. Once these pieces of timber have dried, I give them to my teacher to cut a miter on the table, saw at 45.5 degrees. Once all ends of each pieces have been cut, I remark where the new biscuits will go and biscuit cut the timber. I then dry fit carcass to ensure a flush fit. Once that is done, I use the housing router to cut both sides down, 120 millimeters for my divider. My next step is measuring, marking, and cutting out the divider to size on the drop saw. I then biscuit cut these pieces of timber and follow by gluing these pieces. Once glue is dried, I gather all pieces of timber and run them through the drum sander and follow this by using the orbital sander on all of the pieces. Doing this, the pieces will be smooth and flush. I then dry fit the carcass with the divider and when happy, glue my carcass together. When I glued my carcass, I faced the challenge of my timber not being flush or square. I was able to resolve this issue by adding extra clamps and packers to ensure a flush and square carcass. Next I measure and marked out my door panel to size and cut 8 times at 650 millimeters. I then follow the same steps of cutting the biscuits into the panels and gluing them together. I then measure, mark and cut out the door rails to size. Once this is done, I cut the tongue on the door panel with the tongue and groove router. I then follow this by cutting the tongue and grooves on the short door rails, followed by the long door rails. I then dry fit the door panels with the door rails to ensure a flush fit, and then glue the doors together. My next step consists of measuring, marking and cutting out my drawer front, sides and back on the drops or at their designated lengths. Once this has been completed, I get the front and side pieces of drawer timber to be cut on the dovetail jig to interlock the drawer. I then cut the housing joint onto the back of both side pieces of timber to create an opening for the drawer back. Once this has been done, I give my timber to my teacher to cut the through housing joint for the drawer bottom on the table saw. I then measure, mark and give the plywood to my teacher to cut out 686 millimeters on the table saw, which will be used as my drawer bottom. I then dry fit my drawer and when happy, glue and clamp my drawer together. Once dry, I measure and mark where the screws for my drawer back will go, and then drill the holes. Once that is, screw the drawer bottom to my drawer back. I then get teacher to cut off excess drawer bottom. Next, I cut my legs and leg rails to sizes displayed. I then use the domino cutter to cut legs and leg rails. I then measure, mark and cut my middle rail to size. I then domino cut the middle rail as well as the side rails to join the leg rails. Once completed, I dry fit the legs to ensure I am happy and then glue them together. A problem met was that my dovetail drawer end stuck out due to too many clamps when glued. I resolved this issue by using a flush router to cut down the drawer edge. My next steps consisted of measuring, marking and drilling for my drawer runners. I then applied screws to my carcass and drawer to join the drawer to my project. Another problem faced while making my project was that my drawer did not fit into my piece as it was too tall. I resolved this issue by giving my drawer to my teacher to cut down the drawer 1.5 millimeters and then used the drum sander to get rid of burn marks. My next step consisted of cutting my false front to size on the drop saw. Once completed, pre-drilled holes on my false front. I then added double-sided tape to my drawer front and added my false front to my piece. I then drilled holes for my false front and added screws to ensure the false front was secure to my piece. I then drilled holes on my drawer for my drawer handle. Once drilled, I added screws to add the drawer handle to my project. Another problem I faced in making my project was when I glued my legs together, they were not square, which resulted in 3 legs being on the ground and 1 not. I resolved this issue by scrapping the old pieces and creating a brand new set of legs and leg rails. I added brackets and measured where my legs will be drilled. I then followed this step by PRE drilling my carcass and then my legs for the leg brackets. Once drilled, I lined up brackets from PRE drill and used impact driver to add screws for legs to add to piece. Another problem faced with the creation of my project was that my doors didn't fit into my piece due to wrong measurements and the door panel being too long. I resolved this issue by getting the correct measurements and then getting my teacher to cut the door to the correct size to fit my piece, ensuring a flush fit. My next step was measuring and marking out where door hinges go on door using template by hitting a hammer and nail. I then used the drill press to create holes for the door hinges to sit in. I followed this up by pre-drilling the doors for door hinges, and then screwing in the screws to my doors. I was unable to add the next step photos due to the project having to be printed out, but these steps were how the piece was completed before the due date. I measured and marked the carcass for door hinges. I then pre-drilled the carcass and added screws to add my doors to my piece. Once this was done, I sanded everything with the orbital sander with 80, the 120, then 180 grits, and sandpaper for the smaller cracks. I then applied 3 coats of water-based polyurethane to my project, which ensured a slick and smooth look. Once finish had been applied, I used a laminated trimmer around the back edges of my unit. I then measured, marked, and got my teacher to cut my plywood back to size. I then finally screwed my drawer back to my piece and had finished the production of my project. This photo is the last photo I was able to take before the due date, due to having to be printed out earlier.